All right, let's take our Bibles this morning. Turn to Proverbs chapter number 14, if you would, please. We're going to start reading here verse number 16. As we do so, I want you to notice the kinds of decisions that are going to be kind of mentioned and brought forth in this passage that we're going to take a look at. The passage here this morning, it's not an earth-shattering passage, but the truths that are going to be pulled out of this, I think, can save a lot of heartaches for a lot of people. Proverbs chapter 14, beginning at verse number 16. The Bible there says, "A wise man feareth and departeth from evil, but the fool rageth and is confident. He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The evil bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The poor is hated even of his own neighbor, but the rich hath many friends. He that despiseth his neighbor sinneth, but he that hath mercy on the poor, happy is he." I want to bring a message this morning on the subject, decisions we have to live with. A study done by Columbia University came up with the finding that on the average, we're going to be making 70 decisions each and every day. What that means is that a lot of our decisions are going to be okay. There may be some that are actually pretty good. But the goal in life is to make sure that we avoid those decisions that can be so spectacularly bad that they're life-changing in a way that is painful. In 2009, decisions that had been made by Tiger Woods were revealed to the world, and those decisions had involved other women. That's when his wife learned that her husband had a very serious problem with immorality, and she divorced him. So how bad was that situation for the great Tiger Woods? The immediate aftermath of his infidelity was a $750 million divorce lawsuit, or a settlement rather. The next downward spiral came about when Nike and other companies dropped him as their spokesman for their products. That loss of income was estimated to be around $12 billion. And that loss does not even take into account that since then, he never got his game back. Solomon is now reflecting on some of the decisions that his son is going to have to make. And the thing that dear old dad is trying to stress here in this passage is that a decision is usually a choice between just two things. And this is what we notice all the time in Proverbs. Almost every verse, it's one or the other. Choose this or choose that. We must choose one or the other. And in order to prepare his son for the best life that's possible, Solomon is now going to identify some of the choices that you and I need to make as well. Verse number 16, if you'll circle the word feareth, the first decision comes down to this: we must choose between caution or confidence. A wise man feareth and departeth from evil, but the fool rageth and is confident. In this day of women MMA fighters and macho men, it might not seem like that great of an idea to make a change in your life based on fear, and yet from God's vantage point, fear can be a really good thing. 3 men broke into a home in Silver Springs, Florida. No fear at all of getting caught. And they couldn't believe, as they're rummaging around through this house, they couldn't believe how fortunate they were. Of all of the houses that they could have broken into, they just happened to break into the one whose owner had 3 jars of cocaine in the house. 3 jars of cocaine. These guys had no idea what kind of street value was to be had with that much cocaine. But before they could even find out, they decided to go back to their apartment and enjoy a free high on their newfound cocaine. It was just a short amount of time, or so it seemed. They started snorting their coke, and then they were arrested shortly thereafter. And that's when things really took a bizarre twist, because they were then informed that the older woman whose house they broke into was really upset at whoever did it because they stole the cremated ashes of her husband and 2 dogs. And that's what they'd been snorting. It seems that these 3 bandits had a hard time distinguishing between cocaine and ashes. The world this morning is full of fools who think that they're the smartest people in the room. And when they are looking for trouble, what they don't realize is that God not only has a book of rules, but He also has a sense of humor. And He's going to bring the fool to the end of themselves. Just 5 weeks ago, 5 teenagers in Michigan got up on top of an overpass over I-75, and they decided to come up with a new daring game of throwing rocks at vehicles that were going beneath them. They were throwing rock after rock to see who could get the closest. They were laughing, having a great time. After they threw about 20 rocks at vehicles, finally, one of them struck a vehicle. A large rock went through the windshield of a van going 70 miles an hour, hitting the passenger in the head and chest. The passenger was killed. And that's when the teenagers immediately left the scene and went to McDonald's to grab a bite to eat. They were later arrested, charged with second-degree murder, and if convicted, they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. The oldest was 17. The 4 others were 15 years old, and they will be tried as adults. There are times when we're in the presence of evil, we need to be wise enough to back off, to be cautious, instead of having this false confidence that we can get close to sin without getting hurt. Because only a fool is going to consider that. Verse 17, circle the word angry as we come to it in this verse. Second thing this morning is this: we must choose between retreating or attacking. Verse 17 says, "He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated." Solomon is here throwing out a very strong caution to his son. When you come upon a person that has a short fuse, you better get away from them. Don't hang around that kind of a person, because a person who is soon angry is going to end up doing a lot of stupid things. This is the sort of person that you cannot reason with, and who emotionally, they're going to be very unpredictable. The solution, according to Solomon, not just to his son, but to you and I, is to back off and avoid them like the plague. If a person is drunk or they're high on drugs, you're better off getting away from them. If they happen to be driving a car, then call 911. If they're in a public situation, they're confronting people, they're in a position of hurting somebody, call the police. But there is a third person that you really need to decide that you'd be better off avoiding and walking away from, and that is the person who has a bad temper and a lot of anger issues. The number of road rage incidents involving a gun has doubled in the past year. The one state that is worse than any other in the country for the number of road rage incidents is Florida. 80% of drivers surveyed have admitted to at least one incident where they were involved with aggressive driving. They're mad at somebody. They respond by tailgating. They do something with their vehicle in retaliation. 80% of all drivers admit, yep, I've done it. I'm guilty. 2/3 of all traffic fatalities are caused by road rage. 37% of these incidents involved a gun. The biggest group of people involved are teenagers under the age of 19. 2% of the people involved in road rage actually tried to drive the other person off the road. Half of all drivers who are treated poorly by another driver will respond in like fashion. Half of all road rage incidents are due to a driver who is distracted. They're not seeing, they're not looking around. And almost all of these involve somebody pulling out in front of somebody else and they didn't see them. Cutting somebody off. And if you accidentally pull out in front of somebody behind you could end up doing something very, very stupid, and half of us will respond by doing something stupid. What that means is there's a lot of angry people out there, and almost half of them will have a gun in the vehicle with them. One of the biggest problems with an angry driver is that in their mind, they're the victim. You accidentally cut somebody off. It's your fault. They're the victim, and they're going to punish you. Robert Doyle is a 51-year-old man living in Florida. He was almost hit by another vehicle. He immediately called 911 to turn in that other driver, telling the police that somebody tried to run him off the road. While he was calling 911, the other vehicle called 911. And he said, hey, there's an idiot out here on the road. They're driving crazy. And the driver in that second vehicle told the 911 operator, I'm going to follow him. I'm going to find out who this person is, where they live, so that I can turn them in. I'm going to follow him. And 911 said, that is a bad idea. Leave it alone. Drop it. But the man who was driving told his wife, Kathy, you tell him I'm going to follow him, and I'll call in what the address is and who this nut is. As Doyle pulled into his driveway at his house, the driver of the second vehicle, Gonzalez, pulled in behind him. Both drivers were upset. Both drivers immediately got out of their vehicles. That's when the wife in the second vehicle noticed that Doyle had a gun in his hand. She immediately hollers out the window, pleading with him, don't shoot, don't fire. Doyle aimed his gun at Gonzalez, shot him. As he dropped to the driveway, He aimed his gun, shot him a second time. As the man is laying in the driveway, Doyle then shoots him 3 more times. Then he walks over to the vehicle, to the truck that followed him into the driveway. He points a gun at the wife, her son, and a grandkid in the truck and orders all of them to get out. And he holds a gun on them while her husband is dead in the driveway. Doyle holds a gun on him, waiting for the police to arrive so that they can be arrested. And for some reason, Doyle was shocked when the police arrested him instead. A person that has anger issues cannot think straight. They are irrational. They view themselves as the victim and everybody else is the one who's wrong. Be careful, listening to Solomon, be careful when you're around an angry person because they will always be the victim. They see things that did not happen. And they lose all sense of right and wrong, and they're capable of doing all sorts of things that make no sense to anybody. Verse number 18. This time, circle the word inherit. We must choose between having a life or having a party. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. What exactly does it mean to inherit folly? Everybody knows what an inheritance is, and most people have no trouble at all coming up with this imaginary way of how they one day could be rich. They dream up this wonderful inheritance. Daniel Sharp noticed that an older neighbor was not able to clean out his gutters. And so he walked over to the neighbor's house one day and he said, "Hey, why don't you let me clean them out for you, and that way you don't have to get up on the ladder." He got his ladder, cleaned out the gutters for the old man, and the guy said, "You know, I'd like to pay you for that." And he said, "Don't even think about it. It only took me a couple of minutes. Forget about it." A couple of months later, the older man died. And that's when Daniel Sharp was contacted by a lawyer who informed him that the old man left an inheritance for him of $500,000, and the reason was for one simple act of kindness. Oh, and by the way, my gutters need to be cleaned out. Let me know if you want to volunteer. The simple person is the one who thinks that somehow they're going to be rich or well off simply because they deserve it. Somehow they're going to strike it rich. They can't understand why, when they meet a wealthy person, why that wealthy person doesn't reach into their pocket and hand them thousands of dollars. Can't figure out why that wealthy person won't just pay off their house note. This is the person that buys lottery tickets every chance they get because they deserve to win. They deserve to be rich. This is a person who has a rich relative and their only goal in life is to get that inheritance. And so they're bending over backwards, being nice, and they're waiting on that person to kick the bucket so that they can enjoy the life that they really deserve. And unfortunately, they end up doing nothing with their life because they're counting on having all of this money when their parents die and all of this money is finally turned over to them. What should they be doing? building a life for themselves. Solomon calls it a crown of knowledge. Instead of waiting on mom and dad to leave an inheritance, the wise person will actually decide to build their own life and their own fortune. When Solomon was growing up, he never dreamed that he would ever become the king after his father. It never occurred to him. He was not counting on it. And the reason was because he wasn't the eldest son. And he lived in a day and time historically where when a new king would come on board and take over the throne, they would almost always wipe out the siblings who might pose a threat. It was somewhat common to have your brothers or half-brothers killed so that they could not bring about any kind of an insurrection. Even when David was on his deathbed and Solomon had already been informed that he was God's choice to become king, there was still a last-minute attempt by one of his half-brothers to try to take it away from him. And so while he was growing up with so many uncertainties in his life, Solomon made a great decision. Instead of waiting for this inheritance of a throne, he decided to keep his heart as right with God as possible and let God take care of the details. He decided that he was going to have a life of his own. He pushed himself spiritually. You know, the interesting thing about Solomon is when he was finally placed on the throne, he didn't have to change. He was already a humble person. He already had a walk with God. He was already a man of spirituality. He didn't have to change for the... He'd been preparing his heart for years. He'd never dreamed that this would ever happen. He was as shocked as anybody to find out that God had actually chosen him to be king. His heart was already pure. He was already, as a young man, trusting in God. And God chose to bless him by making him the wealthiest and the wisest person who has ever lived. Verse 19. Circle the word bow. Fourth thing this morning is this. We must choose between waiting on God or becoming bitter. The evil bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. We're told here by Solomon, the life is full of surprises. And one of the biggest surprises of all will be the day when an evil person will actually bow down in submission before a good person. Now, if I could, I'd like to add one recommendation to this verse. Don't hold your breath. Some evil person at work that hates your guts, don't go in tomorrow thinking, well, I read that verse, preacher preached on it, he mentioned it, the evil are going to bow before the good, and today's the day. Don't hold your breath. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, because it will. All I'm saying is that it's probably not going to happen anytime soon. This verse will eventually be fulfilled following the Lord's second coming. In Romans chapter 14, verse 11 says, "For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to God." We know that the day is going to come when every person, saved and lost, good and bad, will bow on bended knee before God. But before that time comes, there will be occasions when the most amazing thing takes place in the lives of some people. And that is when bad people become good. It is called time and chance. Ecclesiastes 9:11 says, I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. What Solomon is here informing us is the life is going to have a lot of surprising turns and twists in it. And so what he's saying is, for those who are strong, don't count solely on your strength. Because when time and chance catches up with you, that strength will fade away. For those who are fast, don't rely upon your speed. Because there's this thing called time and chance that has a way of kind of evening things out. And the reason is because life has a way of throwing a lot of curveballs. And between now and the time that we die, there's going to be a lot of surprises to be seen. On the good side, time and chance can catch up with a person who may possibly for years hated you and despised you. And yet, as life wears upon them and grinds them down and humbles them, time and chance many times will catch up with that person and change them into somebody else, especially when they get saved. Verse number 20, if you'll circle the word friends as we come to it, we must choose between facing reality or living in a dream world. Verse 20, the poor is hated even of his own neighbor, but the rich hath many friends. One of the realities of life is that people are people. If you expect much more than that, you're going to live a very frustrated life. Because reality is we're all but flesh and blood. And that means that we all have the capacity and the potential of disappointing other people. Poor people know from experience that because they're poor, they are many times hated by other poor people because they have nothing to offer to them. If you'll go to the large cities, to the low-income housing, you'll discover very quickly that the crime that is taking place in that is poor against poor. Poor people hate other poor people. That's what Solomon is telling us. That's what we see borne out in the news constantly. But the flip side is that the person of wealth is typically surrounded by people who are only pretending to be their friend. They have money. People will congregate and move in the direction of money. And because of that money, a wealthy person will be surrounded by people who are only pretending to be their friend. When the prodigal son showed up in the far country with a pocket full of his inheritance money, he found himself the most popular person on the planet. People loved being around him. They enjoyed listening to his jokes, and the reason was because he was buying them drinks. People were always nice and courteous to him, especially if they needed to borrow a couple of bucks, and they can pay it back next week. And so many doors were open to him as long as he was spending money as if there was no tomorrow. But when the money was gone, so were his friends. The doors that used to be open were now closed and locked. The people who had borrowed money from him were no longer returning his calls. Now that he was broke, it was as if he had contracted leprosy. And while it might not be right, it is reality. Reality is life isn't fair. Reality is bad things happen to good people. And bad people seemingly can get by with murder while good people can get taken to the cleaners. It's frustrating. But it's also important to know, because reality is not for a chosen few. It's for everybody. And the sooner that Christians can get on board and face reality, the sooner that they'll be in a position to help those people who are hurting. Because reality can be very painful. Meaning there's a lot of people who are going to be hurting. And there are also a lot of people who can be helped. Verse number 21, last thing this morning, circle the word mercy as we come to it. We must choose between happiness or selfishness. Because, and listen to me, you can't have both. He that despiseth his neighbor sinneth, but he that hath mercy on the poor, happy is he. Now, what exactly is happiness? Is it a feeling like being on top of the world? Is it an emotion that you experience under certain conditions? Is it reaching a place in life where you're content and satisfied? Happiness is two things. Number one, happiness is a choice or a decision. And what that means is, if a person's not happy, it's not because of their circumstances. It's because they have failed to make the decision to be happy. Number two, happiness is a relationship. And that relationship is between the individual person and the Lord. People can read this verse, they can walk away from it having a totally wrong impression that all we have to do in order to be happy is to be kind and generous to poor people, and that will automatically put us in happy land. That's not what Solomon is saying. The entire book of Proverbs has to do with wisdom, and wisdom is a gift from God given to those people who have that right relationship with Him. A fool is making bad decisions. The reason is because their relationship with God is not right. If a person's relationship with the Lord is right, God will bless them with wisdom. And because of that great relationship that they have with God Himself, they will also realize how happy it is, or how easy it is to choose to be happy. Unfortunately, people look at happiness as if it's a prize that they get for doing something that's rolling around in their head, and if I do this, I'll be happy. If I do this over here, that'll make me happy. And it's so elusive, they're reaching out for it, they can't ever find it because they're trying to manufacture it, not realizing it's in a relationship, not a circumstance, not a location. It's a relationship. I once knew a man who became the pastor of a rural church in Ohio. When he took over the church, it was small, it was struggling, and it was out in the boondocks. Wasn't anybody around. But he went there with a good heart, wanting to see God do something. And over a period of time, boy, he was able to reach some people. People were getting saved. People were coming to church. And that little country church started growing. Amazing people. The church members came to actually believe and see that they were now a part of a miracle church. After 4 years, this pastor started thinking, if I could pastor this big of a church in the middle of nowhere, just imagine what I could do in an area that was heavily populated. And so he started sending out his resume. And a church in a heavily populated area called him and said, hey, we like what we see on your resume. We'd like to bring you to our church, have you preach for us and candidate. He looked at the area and his thought was, wow, this is a dream come true. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. He went to that church, and that church, friendly people, nice facilities. And wow, what a pay package. They really wanted that preacher to come to their church. He preached for them. They liked him. He liked them. And he went back to his country church, turned in his resignation, left the church, moved his family to a place, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the city. Let's just call it Purgatory. The man left a place where God had led him years before, and he moved his family to Purgatory. Oh, it was wonderful at first. He enjoyed having such nice, clean, expensive facilities. He enjoyed the pay increase. But after a short amount of time, he started having a gnawing feeling that was eating away at him. Because he came to realize that he was pastoring a church in Purgatory, which is a place where God did not show up. He preached the same sermons that he preached at that rural country church, and he preached them in Purgatory. But nothing was happening. He had the same likable personality that the country church back in Ohio liked. He was the same man, same sense of humor, but without the touch of God on his life. He was just another person in the lives of those people. And then he began agonizing over his powerless preaching. He came to the place where he confessed leaving God's will when he left that country church. But no matter how many tears he shed, God refused to show up in Purgatory. So what happened to the preacher who made the mistake of tampering with God's will, choosing instead to make his own selfish decision become a reality? He eventually left that dream church, had to go to another church in another town. And then he left that church to go to another church in another town. and he became a spiritual tumbleweed for a lot of years. To his credit, he never quit the ministry. To his credit, he never became bitter or mad at God. It was just a painful lesson that he was forced to learn the hard way, because selfishness gets in the way and leads you to purgatory, but happiness is always the victim. You can have what you want, or you can have what God wants you to have, but you cannot have both. You make a decision. You follow the desires of your heart, and one day you wake up and understand and realize that your address is now purgatory. And it might take a long time to get back up into God's lap. Let's bow for prayer. Father, we're asking for your blessings to be upon each and every person. And Holy Spirit, I pray that you'd help us to understand the importance of these decisions that we're going to have to face. If we have the right relationship with you, you will then bless us with wisdom. That wisdom will then be able to simplify the decisions and help us to know which we should choose. Holy Spirit, we need your help. This morning, there could be so many who could avoid heartache. And I pray, dear God, that you'd help us to grab hold of the importance of the decisions that we're going to have to make. Our heads are bowed and our eyes are closed.